Giovanni Brusca's thumb hovered over the button. From his position on a hillside overlooking the autostrada, he could see 3 white Fiat Chromas racing south toward Palermo. Inside the lead car, 3 armed carabinieri officers. In the middle vehicle, Judge Giovanni Falcone, driving himself with his wife, Francesca Morvillo, in the passenger seat. In the rear car, Officer Paolo Capuzza and a second escort. Brusca pressed the button. The world split open. 500 kilograms of explosives, TNT, RDX, and ammonium nitrate packed into a drainage culvert beneath the asphalt detonated with catastrophic force. The blast carved a crater 12 feet deep and 30 feet wide into the highway. The asphalt directly above the culvert disintegrated. The road surface buckled and fragmented, launching chunks of concrete weighing hundreds of pounds into the air like shrapnel. The shockwave radiated outward, its initial detonation front traveling at nearly 29,000 feet per second before expanding through the air as a devastating blast wave. The fireball reached temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Celsius. Windows shattered a quarter-mile away. The lead Fiat Chroma absorbed the majority of the blast. The car was directly above the explosives at the moment of detonation. The force lifted the vehicle and tore it apart. Chassis fragments scattered across the highway. The engine block displaced. Metal shredded into twisted wreckage. Officers Vito Schifani, Rocco DiCillo, and Antonio Montinaro were killed instantly. Their bodies subjected to forces that no armor or training could protect against. Montinaro, the head of Falcone's security escort, died leading from the front as he had always done. Falcone's car, traveling 10 meters behind, was hit by the blast wave. The armored Fiat weighed over 2 tons, but the explosion treated it like a toy. The car lifted, spun sideways, and slammed into the concrete median barrier at an angle. The impact crushed the driver's side. The armored windows cracked but held. The engine block was shoved backward into the passenger compartment. Judge Falcone was still alive. Barely. Pinned behind the wheel by the crushed metal, his legs shattered, his chest compressed by the steering column, he was hemorrhaging internally. His wife, Francesca Morvillo, a judge herself, suffered massive trauma. Both were critically injured, consciousness fading in and out. The rear car, driven by Paolo Capuzza, somehow escaped the worst. Capuzza saw the explosion, an orange and black fireball erupting from the road ahead, and reacted with the split-second instincts of a trained driver. He braked hard, swerved, and managed to keep the car under control. It stopped, perhaps 50 meters behind the crater, the windshield covered in debris, the hood dented by falling chunks of asphalt, but intact. Capuzza jumped out, weapon drawn, scanning for attackers. Then he ran toward the wreckage. Giovanni Falcone was born into Palermo's labyrinth on May 18, 1939, in a city where omertà, the code of silence, was more sacred than any law written in Rome. His neighborhood, La Calza, sat in Palermo's ancient heart, where narrow streets twisted like capillaries and everyone knew everyone else's business, or pretended not to. He grew up blocks away from the beginning of everything. As a boy, he played in streets controlled by Cosa Nostra families who operated with such brazen confidence that their presence felt less like criminal activity and more like a parallel government. The Mafia wasn't hiding in Falcone's Palermo. It was the wallpaper, the background noise, the unspoken understanding that certain questions were never asked and certain men were never challenged. His father, Arturo Falcone, was a provincial chemist with the provincial administration. Middle class, respectable. The family lived modestly but comfortably, which in post-war Sicily meant they existed in that delicate space between poverty and the kind of wealth that drew dangerous attention. Giovanni was quiet, intense, bookish, the kind of child who read everything and forgot nothing. His teachers noticed the analytical precision in his schoolwork, the way he approached problems by dismantling them into component parts. In 1960, Falcone enrolled at the University of Palermo to study law. It was not a revolutionary choice. Thousands of young Sicilians pursued legal careers, and many ended up defending the very criminals Falcone would later prosecute. But something in him was different. Where others saw the mafia as an inevitable fact of Sicilian life, Falcone saw it as a puzzle that could be solved if someone had the patience and courage to look directly at it. After graduation and military service, he returned to Palermo as a court-appointed lawyer. It was boring work, poorly paid, the kind of cases that barely registered in the city's consciousness. Petty theft, minor fraud. But Falcone watched, learned, and waited. He began to notice patterns, how certain names appeared repeatedly, how money moved through seemingly legitimate businesses, how the same lawyers represented an ever-expanding network of clients who all seemed connected to one another through invisible threads. In 1978, everything changed. Two events reshaped Italian history and Giovanni Falcone's life. The first was personal. Falcone requested a transfer to the office of the investigating magistrate, specifically to work on mafia-related cases. It was professional suicide by conventional wisdom. Anti-Mafia prosecutors in Sicily had short careers, either because they were killed or because they were transferred, sidelined, or bought off. The smart move was to avoid Cosa Nostra entirely. Falcone walked directly toward it. The second was national, the murder of Aldo Moro. The former prime minister was kidnapped by the Red Brigades, held for 55 days, and executed. His body was found in the trunk of a car in Rome. The murder shocked Italy out of its complacency about political violence and organized crime. Suddenly, investigating Italy's criminal underworld wasn't just a dangerous job, it was urgent. Falcone began with heroin. In the late 1970s, Sicily had become the refining center for heroin destined for the American market. The mafia families, particularly the Corleonese clan led by Totò Riina and Bernardo Provenzano, were making billions. Raw morphine base arrived from Turkey and the Golden Triangle, was refined in clandestine laboratories hidden in Palermo's countryside, then shipped to New York through a network that stretched from Sicily to New Jersey. The operation required bankers, chemists, smugglers, corrupt officials, and an organizational structure more complex than most corporations. Falcone studied it the way a scientist studies an organism. He began tracking money. Bank records, wire transfers, shell companies registered in Switzerland and Luxembourg. He discovered that the mafia's financial infrastructure was sophisticated, layered, and crucially vulnerable to investigation if someone had the legal tools and the will to use them. He needed allies. In 1980, Falcone formed a partnership that would define both their lives. Paolo Borsellino, his childhood friend and fellow magistrate. They had grown up in adjacent neighborhoods, attended the same schools, shared a similar understanding of Palermo's hidden architecture. But while Falcone was methodical and reserved, Borsellino was passionate and outspoken. Together, they were devastating. They created what became known as the Anti-Mafia pool, a team of magistrates who shared information, coordinated investigations, and protected one another. Pooling resources was revolutionary. Traditionally, Italian prosecutors worked in isolation, guarding their cases jealously, competing for glory. Falcone understood that the mafia's greatest advantage was its ability to operate as a network, while the state operated as a collection of individuals. He decided to fight structure with structure. The pool's other key member was Rocco Cinici, the chief investigating magistrate who had mentored both Falcone and Borsellino. Chinichi recognized what they were building and gave them the institutional cover to continue. He also understood the risks. On July 29, 1983, Rocco Chinichi left his apartment building to go to work. He walked to his armored Fiat 132, accompanied by 2 Carabinieri officers and the building's doorman. As Chinichi reached for the car door, a car bomb detonated. The blast killed Chinichi, both officers, and the doorman. It wounded 22 bystanders and left a crater in the street. The Mafia had sent a message, "We can reach you anywhere." Falcone and Borsellino received the opposite message. Now it's war. Falcone threw himself into the investigation with an obsessiveness that bordered on self-destruction. He worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. His office became his home. He ate meals at his desk. His colleagues watched him transform from a methodical prosecutor into something harder, sharper. A man who understood he was racing against time and bullets. He needed a breakthrough. It came from an unexpected source, a mafioso who decided to talk. Tommaso Buscetta was a heroin trafficker, a killer, and a member of Cosa Nostra's upper echelons. He had survived the mafia wars of the early 1980s, a blood-soaked internal conflict that killed hundreds, but his losses were staggering. The Corleonese clan, led by Totò Riina, had murdered 11 members of Buscetta's family: his sons, his brother, his son-in-law, his nephews. They had violated the mafia's supposed codes, killing women and children. Buscetta fled to Brazil. Italian and Brazilian authorities arrested him in October 1983. He was extradited to Italy, where he sat in a high-security prison cell, contemplating his options. He had none. His family was dead. His old alliances were gone. The mafia he had known, an organization supposedly bound by codes of honor, had been replaced by something more savage. Falcone flew to Brazil to meet him. The meeting was a gamble. No high-ranking mafioso had ever cooperated with Italian authorities before. Omertà, the code of silence, wasn't just cultural, it was survival insurance. If you talked, you died. Your family died. Your friends died. But Falcone had studied Buscetta's psychology. He knew the man felt betrayed by what Cosa Nostra had become. Falcone offered him something beyond protection, a chance to destroy the men who had murdered his family. Buscetta talked. For months, Buscetta sat across from Falcone and described the internal architecture of Cosa Nostra. He explained the commission, the cupola, that governed all mafia families in Sicily. He revealed the structure and identified many key members who sat on the commission, who controlled which territories, who ordered which killings. He described initiation rituals, the structure of families, the rules of conflict resolution. He shattered the myth, carefully cultivated by the mafia and some politicians, that Cosa Nostra didn't exist, that it was just a loose collection of criminals with no formal organization. Though later pentiti would complete the map of the organization's full hierarchy, Buscetta's testimony provided the crucial foundation. Falcone recorded everything. He cross-referenced Buscetta's testimony against surveillance records, phone taps, bank statements, and arrest records. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. For the first time in Italian history, prosecutors understood how Cosa Nostra functioned not as a folklore myth, but as a criminal corporation with organizational charts, hierarchies, and decision-making processes. By 1985, Falcone had enough. He issued 475 arrest warrants. The operation was called Maxi Trial for a reason. It was the largest anti-mafia prosecution ever attempted anywhere in the world. The trial required a custom-built bunker courtroom inside Palermo's Ucciardone prison, a massive reinforced structure with bulletproof glass cages for defendants, bomb-proof walls, and security checkpoints that could process hundreds of people daily. The trial began on February 10, 1986. Inside the courtroom, 474 defendants sat in cages. Outside, thousands of Carabinieri officers secured the perimeter. Helicopters circled overhead. Armored vehicles blocked the streets. The trial wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a siege. The defendants represented every major mafia family in Sicily. Among them, Michele Greco, known as the Pope, chairman of the Cupola; Pippo Calò, the mafia's chief financial officer; Salvatore Riina, though he was still a fugitive and tried in absentia. The cage was filled with men who controlled politicians, businesses, banks, and entire towns. Men who had ordered hundreds of murders. Men who had never imagined they would see the inside of a courtroom except as spectators. Buscetta testified for weeks. He sat in a secured witness box surrounded by armed guards and named names. He described murders in clinical detail. He explained how Cosa Nostra had evolved from a rural protection racket into an international drug cartel. He described the mafia wars, the brutal internal purges that had left hundreds dead. The defendants screamed. They hurled insults. They threatened. Some laughed, believing this was theater that would end with their release. The trial lasted 22 months. On December 16, 1987, the verdicts came down. 19 defendants received life sentences. Hundreds more received sentences ranging from a few years to decades. The total sentencing exceeded 2,600 years in prison. It was a legal earthquake. For the first time in modern Italian history, the state had successfully prosecuted the mafia's upper hierarchy using evidence rather than just confessions extracted under pressure. Falcone had won, but he had also signed his own death warrant. Inside Cosa Nostra, the reaction was volcanic. The Maxi Trial hadn't just imprisoned hundreds of men, it had humiliated the organization. The mafia's greatest weapon had always been the perception of its invincibility. The idea that Cosa Nostra was untouchable, that it operated beyond the reach of the state, that it would always win in the end. The trial had shattered that mythology in front of the entire world. Salvatore Totò Riina, the undisputed boss of bosses, was enraged. Riina was a short, compact man with the face of a rural school teacher and the instincts of a serial killer. He had been born in Corleone, a hardscrabble town in Sicily's interior, where poverty and violence were two sides of the same coin. By his 20s, Riina had murdered his way into the Corleonese clan's leadership. By his 40s, he controlled all of Cosa Nostra through a combination of strategic brilliance and psychopathic ruthlessness. Riina's philosophy was simple. Power came from fear. Not respect, fear. When someone challenged Cosa Nostra, you didn't negotiate, you didn't compromise. You killed them so spectacularly that everyone else understood the cost of resistance. In the months following the Maxi Trial verdicts, Riina convened meetings in safe houses throughout Palermo. The agenda was singular: re-establishing Cosa Nostra's reputation through violence. The discussion wasn't whether to retaliate, but how much blood was necessary to restore the proper order of things. Several names came up repeatedly: Paolo Borsellino, judges who had participated in the trial, politicians who had supported anti-mafia legislation. But one name dominated every conversation: Giovanni Falcone. Riina understood something crucial. Falcone wasn't just another prosecutor. He was a symbol. He represented the possibility that the mafia could be defeated through investigation, evidence, and law. Kill Falcone and you would kill that possibility in the mind of every Italian. You would send a message to every judge, every police officer, every journalist who was considering joining the fight. This is what happens. Surveillance on Falcone began immediately. Cosa Nostra activated its network. Associates watched his house in Palermo. They tracked his movements between courtrooms. They noted his routines, his security escort, his travel patterns. They photographed his cars. They monitored airports and flight schedules through various means, though the exact sources of their intelligence remained difficult to prove. They even placed a bug in his office, though it was discovered before it could provide useful intelligence. What they learned was both encouraging and frustrating. Falcone lived like a man who knew he was hunted. His apartment was in a high-security building with carabinieri stationed outside 24 hours a day. He traveled in armored cars with armed escorts. He varied his routes. He kept his schedule unpredictable. Assassinating him wouldn't be simple. But Riina was patient. Cosa Nostra had killed hundreds of people: cops, judges, politicians, journalists, rival mafiosi. They had blown up buildings, ambushed motorcades, poisoned targets, rigged car bombs. They had the resources, the expertise, and the will. It was only a matter of finding the right moment and the right method. Then, in 1991, Falcone made a decision that would ultimately kill him. He accepted a position in Rome. The move to the Ministry of Justice was supposed to be a promotion. In theory, Falcone would be designing national anti-mafia strategies, coordinating efforts between different regions, bringing his expertise to a broader scale. In practice, it was a nightmare. The problem wasn't the mafia, it was his colleagues. Italian bureaucracy is a labyrinth of competing fiefdoms, jealousies, and turf wars. Falcone's success in Palermo had made him famous, which made him resented. Other magistrates, men who had spent decades climbing the hierarchy through connections and politics rather than results, watched this upstart from Sicily arrive in Rome, trailing headlines and international recognition. They saw him as arrogant, publicity-seeking, too ambitious. The attacks began almost immediately. Not physical violence, but bureaucratic sabotage. His proposals were delayed or watered down. His appointments were questioned. Colleagues leaked unflattering stories to newspapers, suggesting that Falcone was more interested in his own fame than actual results. Some articles questioned whether his methods were legally sound, whether his reliance on pentiti testimony was corrupting the judicial system. Falcone found himself in meetings where his ideas were dismissed by men who had never investigated a mafia case in their lives. He watched as institutional inertia ground his initiatives into dust. The same legal system he had served for decades was now treating him like a threat. The most devastating blow came in January 1991, when Falcone was passed over for the position of chief prosecutor of Palermo. The job should have been his. He was the most qualified magistrate in Italy for the position. Instead, it went to someone with minimal anti-mafia experience, a decision widely interpreted as punishment for Falcone's high profile and independence. Falcone was crushed. For the first time in his career, he considered quitting. But he stayed. He continued working in Rome, flying back to Palermo most weekends to see his wife Francesca and maintain his connections. The flights became routine. His security detail typically traveled separately, meeting him at the airport. Every Friday evening or Saturday morning, he would land at Palermo's Punta Raisi airport, transfer to an armored car with his escort, and drive south into the city on the A29 highway. Cosa Nostra was watching. In early 1992, Totò gave the order. Not a suggestion or a proposal. An order. Giovanni Falcone was to be killed, and the killing was to be spectacular. Riina selected Giovanni Brusca to lead the operation. Brusca was 35 years old, born into a mafia family in San Giuseppe Hato, a town in the hills above Palermo. His father had been a mafioso. His brother was a mafioso. Brusca himself had been inducted into Cosa Nostra as a teenager, and had spent his 20s murdering his way up the hierarchy. By the early 1990s, he was one of Riina's most trusted killers, a man who had personally strangled victims, dissolved bodies in acid, and ordered the assassination of rivals. Brusca had another crucial qualification. He understood explosives. The team Brusca assembled read like a who's who of Cosa Nostra's most capable killers. Santino Di Matteo, who would later turn pentito, Pietro Rampula, Gioacchino La Barbera, Vincenzo Scarantino. Men who had killed before, who understood surveillance, logistics, and operational security. The first challenge was tactical: where to hit Falcone. His apartment in Palermo was impossible. Too much security, too many witnesses, too many carabinieri stationed at the entrance. The courthouse was equally impractical. Rome was too far from Cosa Nostra's power base. They needed a location where they could control the environment, prepare the attack site in advance, and escape before police could respond. The answer was obvious: the highway. Falcone flew into Palermo from Rome almost every weekend, landing at Punta Raisi Airport on the coast west of the city. From the airport, the only practical route into Palermo was the A29 Autostrada, a modern highway that hugged the coastline before turning inland. The route was predictable. Falcone's motorcade always took the same highway. The only variables were the day and time. Brusca began scouting locations in early 1992. He drove the highway repeatedly, analyzing every kilometer for tactical possibilities. He needed a stretch where the road was isolated enough to prepare explosives without being discovered, but public enough that Falcone would have no reason to suspect danger. He found it near Capaci. The highway ran through a cutting, a stretch where engineers had carved the road through elevated terrain. On one side was a steep embankment rising to a hillside. On the other side was the concrete median barrier. Beneath the highway, drainage culverts allowed water to flow during heavy rains. The culverts were large enough to hide a significant amount of explosives, accessible from the embankment above, and positioned directly in the path Falcone's motorcade would take. Perfect. Brusca ordered the construction of the bomb. Building a bomb large enough to kill an armored motorcade is not a weekend project. It requires hundreds of kilograms of explosives, detonators, wiring, and a remote triggering system reliable enough to work on the first attempt. Failure meant discovery. Discovery meant arrests. Arrest meant life in prison for everyone involved. The explosives came from multiple sources. Some was dynamite stolen from construction sites. Some was military-grade TNT acquired through corrupt contacts. Some was ammonium nitrate fertilizer, the same compound used in truck bombs, purchased in bulk and mixed with fuel oil to create a powerful explosive slurry. The total payload was estimated at 400 to 500 kilograms. The team worked at night. They transported the explosives in small batches, hidden in cars and trucks that wouldn't attract attention. They accessed the drainage culvert from the hillside above, lowering metal drums filled with the explosive mixture into the culvert, using ropes and sheer muscle. The work was physically exhausting, mentally draining, and terrifying. One mistake, one spark, and everyone would die instantly. The detonation system was the most technically complex component. Brusca couldn't be near the highway when the bomb exploded. That would be suicidal. He needed a remote trigger. They chose a radio-controlled system similar to those used in remote control cars but modified for military applications. The signal would travel from Brusca's position on the hillside several hundred meters away to a receiver connected to the detonators buried in the explosives. They tested the system repeatedly. First, with small charges in isolated locations, confirming that the signal was reliable. Then, with larger test explosions to verify that the detonators would function under the stress of being buried in half a ton of explosives. Every test carried the risk of discovery. Every test increased the chance that police surveillance would notice the unusual activity. Remarkably, no one did. By May 1992, everything was ready. The explosives were in place, packed into the drainage culvert beneath the highway. The wiring was complete. The detonators were armed. All Brusca needed now was confirmation that Falcone would be on the highway. And when? Cosa Nostra had cultivated contacts throughout Sicily who could provide information about travel schedules and movements. While the specific intelligence sources for the Capaci operation remained subject to investigation and debate. What's certain is that the Mafia learned Falcone would be arriving at Punta Raisi Airport on May 23, 1992. On May 22, 1992, Brusca received word. Falcone would be arriving at Punta Raisi Airport the following day, Saturday, May 23rd. Departure time from Rome, approximately 4 p.m. Expected arrival in Palermo, 5:30 p.m. The motorcade would leave the airport shortly after, heading east on the A29 toward Palermo. Brusca mobilized his team. May 23, 1992 started as an ordinary day in Rome. Falcone woke early in his apartment, went through his morning routine, and headed to the Ministry of Justice. He had meetings scheduled, paperwork to review, the endless bureaucratic obligations that defined his new position. There are conflicting accounts about whether Falcone had any premonition that day. Some colleagues later claimed he seemed distracted, quieter than usual. Others said he was perfectly normal. What is documented is that he made several phone calls that afternoon, tying up loose ends before leaving for the weekend. At some point, he called Francesca Morvillo, his wife. She was already in Palermo at their apartment in the city. They discussed logistics, when he would arrive, dinner plans, the mundane details of a couple coordinating their schedules. It was a completely ordinary conversation. Neither of them knew it would be their last. Falcone left the ministry around 3 p.m. His security escort drove him to Rome's Ciampino Airport, where a small government plane waited. The flight to Palermo would take roughly 90 minutes. His full security detail would meet him at the airport in Palermo. Meanwhile, in Sicily, Giovanni Brusca was already in position. He had driven to the hillside above the A29 highway near Capaci early that morning. With him were binoculars, a radio, and the remote detonator, a small electronic box with a button that would complete an electrical circuit and ignite the explosives buried below. Other team members were positioned along the highway at strategic points, some near the airport to confirm when Falcone's plane landed, others along the highway to radio updates on the motorcade's progress. The plan was simple in theory, but required precise timing and execution. The spotters at the airport would confirm Falcone's arrival and send a radio signal to the highway team. The highway team would track the motorcade's approach and radio its speed and position to Brusca. Brusca would watch through his binoculars, wait until the motorcade reached the kill zone directly above the buried explosives, and press the button. Timing was everything. Detonate too early, and the lead car might survive, leaving Falcone alive to escape or fight back. Detonate too late, and the motorcade would pass over the explosives harmlessly, wasting months of preparation and alerting authorities to the plot. Brusca waited. At 5:25 p.m., Falcone's plane touched down at Punta Raisi Airport. The spotters confirmed. Target arrived. The motorcade was forming up. 3 white Fiat Chromas pulled out of the airport complex and accelerated onto the A29 highway. In the lead car, officers Vito Schifani, Rocco De Cillo, and Antonio Montinaro, all carabinieri specialists, all heavily armed. In the middle car, Judge Giovanni Falcone, driving himself, with his wife Francesca Morvillo in the passenger seat. In the rear car, Officer Paolo Capuzza and a second escort. The motorcade moved fast. Falcone preferred high speeds on the highway. Harder to target, harder to intercept. The Fiat Chromas accelerated to 160 kilometers per hour, racing east along the coastal highway. Radio chatter crackled across the Mafia network. "They're coming. Speed high, ETA 10 minutes. Brusca adjusted his position. He focused his binoculars on the stretch of highway below, where the explosives waited. His thumb rested on the detonator button. At 5:56 p.m., the motorcade entered the kill zone. Brusca pressed the button. The explosion was equivalent to roughly 500 kilograms of explosives. The detonation front inside the explosive mass traveled at nearly 29,000 feet per second. But the blast wave expanding through the air moved much slower as it radiated outward in an expanding sphere of overpressure. The asphalt directly above the culvert vaporized. The road surface buckled and fragmented, launching chunks of concrete weighing hundreds of pounds into the air like shrapnel. The lead Fiat Chroma absorbed the majority of the blast. The car was directly above the explosives at the moment of detonation. The force lifted the vehicle and tore it apart. The chassis shredded, engine block displaced. Metal twisted and scattered across a 100-meter radius. Officers Schifani, DiCillo, and Montanaro were killed instantly, their bodies subjected to forces that no armor or training could protect against. Falcone's car, traveling 10 meters behind, was hit by the edge of the blast wave. The armored Fiat weighed over 2 tons, but the explosion treated it like a toy. The car lifted, spun sideways, and slammed into the concrete median barrier at an angle. The impact crushed the driver's side. The armored windows cracked but held. The engine block was shoved backward into the passenger compartment. Falcone was pinned behind the wheel, his legs crushed, his chest compressed by the steering column, internal injuries hemorrhaging blood into his abdominal cavity. Morvillo had suffered catastrophic trauma as well. Fractured ribs, massive internal damage. Both were critically injured but conscious, at least initially. The rear car, driven by Paolo Capuzza, somehow escaped the worst. Capuzza saw the explosion, an orange and black fireball erupting from the road ahead, and reacted with the split-second instincts of a trained driver. He braked hard, swerved, and managed to keep the car under control. It stopped perhaps 50 meters behind the crater, the windshield covered in debris, the hood dented by falling chunks of asphalt, but intact. Capuzza jumped out, weapon drawn, scanning for attackers. Then he ran toward the wreckage. The crater was a wound in the earth, 12 feet deep, 30 feet wide, edges still smoking. The lead car was gone, just fragments of chassis and engine scattered across the blast radius. Metal twisted beyond recognition. The middle car was a mangled wreck against the barrier, steam rising from the ruined engine, fuel leaking onto the cracked asphalt. Capuzza reached Falcone's car and looked inside. The judge was alive, pinned behind the wheel, bleeding from multiple wounds, his face pale. Morvillo was beside him, badly injured. Capuzza radioed for emergency assistance, screaming into the handset. "Officer down, multiple casualties, highway at 29 near Capaci, send everything." Other motorists began arriving. Some stopped to help, others simply stood paralyzed by what they were seeing. A few grabbed fire extinguishers from their cars and tried to suppress the small fires burning in the debris field. One man, a doctor who had been driving to Palermo, pushed through the gathering crowd and assessed Falcone's injuries. He knew immediately that the judge needed a trauma center immediately, or he would die within the hour. Police helicopters appeared overhead within 10 minutes. Ambulances arrived shortly after, sirens wailing. Firefighters worked to extract Falcone from the wreckage, using hydraulic tools to cut through the twisted metal. It took 23 minutes to free him. By then, Giovanni Falcone knew he was dying. Falcone was airlifted to Palermo's Policlinico Hospital, the city's major trauma center. He arrived still alive, though barely. Doctors worked on him for over an hour. They transfused blood, repaired what they could, fought to stabilize the internal hemorrhaging. But the damage was too extensive. His liver was lacerated, his spleen ruptured, his pelvis shattered. The blast had dealt him mortal wounds. At 7 p.m., just over an hour after the explosion, Judge Giovanni Falcone's heart stopped. Doctors attempted resuscitation but could not revive him. The man who had spent 13 years hunting the mafia, who had survived countless death threats, who had changed the course of Italian history, was dead at age 53. Francesca Morvillo fought longer. She had been taken to the same hospital. Her injuries equally catastrophic. Multiple organ damage, massive internal bleeding. Medical teams worked through the evening and into the night. But her body could not sustain the trauma. She died in the early hours of May 24th, several hours after her husband. The news hit Italy like a second explosion. By midnight, crowds were gathering in Palermo's streets. People emerged from their homes carrying candles, photographs of Falcone, handmade signs reading, "Basta!" Enough. The rage was volcanic. For decades, Sicilians had lived under the mafia's shadow, accepting it as an unchangeable fact of life. The Capaci bombing shattered that acceptance. This wasn't just another mafia murder. This was a declaration of war against the Italian state, committed in broad daylight on a public highway with explosives powerful enough to be heard for miles. The audacity was breathtaking. The message was unmistakable. We can kill anyone, anywhere, anytime. But the mafia had miscalculated. Instead of terrifying Italians into submission, the Capaci bombing enraged them. The crowds in Palermo grew through the night. Thousands became tens of thousands. People who had never attended a protest, who had avoided political engagement their entire lives, took to the streets. They chanted Falcone's name. They demanded action. They confronted their own history of complicity and silence. Television networks broadcast continuous coverage. The crater in the highway, filmed from helicopters, became the defining image of the moment. A massive wound in the earth, surrounded by debris and emergency vehicles. Newspapers printed front-page photographs of the wreckage. Radio stations played tributes. The explosion that was supposed to break Italy's will had instead crystallized its fury. In Rome, the government scrambled to respond. Prime Minister Giuliano Amato convened emergency meetings. The Minister of Interior mobilized additional police and military forces to Sicily. Politicians who had spent years downplaying the mafia threat suddenly discovered their anti-mafia credentials. The political calculus had shifted overnight. Supporting aggressive anti-mafia measures was no longer politically risky. It was politically mandatory. But Italy's anger needed a target, and investigations were already underway. The Capaci crime scene was a forensic nightmare. The explosion had scattered evidence across hundreds of square meters. Bomb fragments were embedded in asphalt, concrete, and vehicle wreckage. The crater itself was filled with debris, soil, and water from ruptured drainage systems. Every piece of evidence had to be documented, photographed, cataloged, and analyzed. Investigators from Italy's National Police, Carabinieri, and specialized bomb disposal units descended on the site within hours of the attack. They worked through the night, setting up portable lighting systems, cordoning off the area, beginning the painstaking process of reconstruction. The first breakthrough came quickly: the size of the explosion. Based on the crater dimensions and blast damage patterns, forensic experts calculated that the bomb had contained between 400 and 500 kilograms of explosives. This wasn't a car bomb or a small charge. This was an industrial-scale weapon that required significant resources, expertise, and planning. The second breakthrough was the detonation method. Investigators found fragments of electronic components in the debris: circuit boards, wiring, pieces of a radio receiver. The bomb hadn't been triggered by a timer or a pressure plate. It had been remotely detonated, which meant someone had been watching the motorcade and pressed a button at the precise moment to maximize casualties. This was crucial information. Remote detonation required line of sight. The bomber had to be somewhere nearby, elevated with a clear view of the highway. Investigators turned their attention to the hillside overlooking the blast site. They found Brusca's observation post within 48 hours, tire tracks from vehicles that had been parked in the underbrush, footprints, cigarette butts. Most importantly, a discarded battery pack from the type of radio transmitter that could trigger a remote detonator. But physical evidence alone wouldn't identify the bombers. For that, investigators needed human intelligence. They needed someone to talk. The problem with investigating Cosa Nostra is that everyone knows the price of cooperation: death. Not just your death, your family's death, your friend's death, everyone you've ever cared about. Omertà isn't maintained through honor, it's maintained through terror. But the Capaci bombing had changed the equation. The spectacular nature of the attack, the public outrage, the massive police presence, all of it signaled that Cosa Nostra's world was about to collapse. Smart mafiosi began calculating survival odds. Some concluded that the safest move was to cooperate with authorities before everyone else did and claim the best deals. The first significant pentito to provide information about Capaci was Santino Di Matteo. Di Matteo had been part of Brusca's team involved in transporting explosives and maintaining security during the preparation phase. He hadn't pressed the detonator button, but he knew who had. He knew the planning, the participants, the chain of command, and he knew that Totò had personally ordered the assassination. Di Matteo was arrested in September 1993 on unrelated mafia charges. In custody, facing life in prison, watching the massive police crackdown unfold across Sicily, he made a decision. He requested to speak with anti-mafia prosecutors. What he told them was devastating. Di Matteo described the entire operation in detail: how Brusca had scouted locations, how the explosives were assembled and placed, how the surveillance network tracked Falcone's movements, how the radio system worked. He named names, every member of the bombing team, their roles, their locations on the day of the attack. Most importantly, he confirmed what investigators suspected but couldn't prove. Giovanni Brusca had personally detonated the bomb, and Totò had given the order. With Di Matteo's testimony, prosecutors could build criminal cases. Arrest warrants were prepared. Police operations were planned. But there was a problem. Brusca and Riina were both fugitives, hidden somewhere in Sicily's vast network of mafia safe houses, protected by omertà and fear. Finding them would require patience, surveillance, and luck. While investigators hunted the Capaci bombers, Italy's political system convulsed. The public demanded action, and the government delivered. Not because politicians had suddenly grown brave, but because they had no choice. The alternative was political suicide. On May 26, 1992, 3 days after the bombing, the Italian parliament passed emergency anti-mafia legislation that had been stalled in committee for years. The laws expanded police surveillance powers, increased prison sentences for mafia-related crimes, and created new specialized units focused exclusively on organized crime. On June 8th, the government established the DIA, Direzione Investigativa Anti-Mafia, a new interagency task force combining resources from Italy's various police organizations. The DIA was given broad powers to investigate mafia activity, coordinate operations, and share intelligence. It was exactly the kind of institutional structure Falcone had advocated for during his time at the Ministry of Justice. Thousands of police and military personnel were deployed to Sicily. Roadblocks appeared across the island. Surveillance operations targeted known mafia associates. Arrests accelerated, not just of soldiers and associates, but of businessmen, politicians, and professionals suspected of mafia ties. Cosa Nostra was under siege, but the mafia wasn't finished. 57 days after murdering Giovanni Falcone, they struck again. July 19th, 1992, Via d'Amelio, Palermo. Paolo Borsellino had spent the nearly 2 months since Falcone's death in a state of controlled fury. He knew he was next on Cosa Nostra's list. Everyone knew. His security detail had been reinforced. He varied his routes obsessively. He slept in different locations. He told friends and family he didn't expect to survive the year. On that Sunday evening, Borsellino visited his mother at her apartment on Via d'Amelio, a quiet residential street in Palermo. It was a routine visit. He saw her most Sundays. His security escort accompanied him, 5 officers in 2 cars. At 6:50 p.m., as Borsellino pressed the buzzer to his mother's building, a car bomb detonated. The explosion killed Borsellino instantly, along with 5 officers from his escort: Agostino Catalano, Emanuele Aloy, Vincenzo Limulli, Walter Eddie Cosina, and Claudio Trena. The blast was smaller than Capaci, only 80 to 100 kilograms of explosives, but devastatingly effective. The force destroyed several buildings, wounded dozens of civilians, and left another crater in a Palermo street. Italy had been mourning Falcone. Now it was burying Borsellino. The funerals became national events. Television networks broadcast them live. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets as the coffins passed. In both Rome and Palermo, the crowds were so large that traffic came to a standstill for hours. One moment from the funerals became iconic. Rosaria Schifani, widow of Officer Vito Schifani, who had died at Capaci, gave a eulogy that was broadcast nationwide. She stood at the microphone, her voice shaking with grief and rage, and addressed the mafiosi directly. "I forgive you, but you must get on your knees. If you have the courage to change, you must get on your knees." Then she turned to the politicians and officials in attendance. "I ask the men of the Mafia, who are certainly here in this church because they have the courage to come. I ask them, what do they get out of all this? A life full of nothing?" The speech was searing, accusatory, and unforgettable. It articulated what millions of Italians felt: rage at the Mafia, disgust with political complicity, exhaustion with the endless cycle of violence. Inside Cosa Nostra, the mood was different. The Capaci and Via d'Amelio bombings had achieved their immediate objective: killing Italy's 2 most effective anti-mafia magistrates. Falcone and Borsellino were dead. Their knowledge, their networks, their investigations, all gone. For a brief moment, Totò Riina believed he had won. He had miscalculated catastrophically. The bombings didn't terrify Italy into submission. They galvanized a generation. Young people who had been politically apathetic suddenly began attending anti-mafia demonstrations. University students organized rallies. Teachers integrated anti-mafia education into curricula. The cultural shift was seismic. More practically, the Italian government had declared total war on Cosa Nostra. Resources that had previously been unavailable were suddenly unlimited. Police forces were expanded. Intelligence agencies refocused priorities. International cooperation accelerated. The FBI, DEA, and European police agencies began sharing information with Italian authorities at unprecedented levels. The legal infrastructure Falcone had built was now operational. The methods he had pioneered, following money, analyzing organizational structures using pentiti testimony were being deployed on a massive scale. Every mafia member, associate, and sympathizer in Sicily was now under scrutiny. Pentiti began cooperating in droves. The dam had broken. Men who had spent decades in Cosa Nostra suddenly realized that the organization couldn't protect them anymore. Some cooperated out of fear, others out of revenge, some out of genuine remorse. The motivations didn't matter. The intelligence they provided was devastating. By late 1992, investigators had accumulated enough information to map Cosa Nostra's entire structure. Who reported to whom, which families controlled which territories, where money was hidden, or who had ordered which killings. For the first time, the state understood the mafia as well as the mafia understood itself. The hunt for Totò Riina intensified. Riina had been a fugitive since 1969, 23 years on the run. He had never been photographed as an adult. Police had no idea what he looked like. He lived in Palermo, hidden in plain sight, protected by a network of safe houses and loyal associates. He moved frequently, communicated through intermediaries, and maintained operational security so strict that even most mafiosi didn't know his location. But by 1993, the pressure was unbearable. Pentiti were describing his habits, his routines, the vehicles he used. Surveillance teams were watching known associates, tracking patterns, waiting for mistakes. The breakthrough came through old-fashioned police work. Investigators focused on Riina's family, his wife and children who lived in Palermo under false identities. By following them, monitoring their movements and contacts, police hoped to identify the network protecting Riina. On January 15, 1993, surveillance teams observed suspicious activity near Via Bernini in Palermo's middle-class residential neighborhood. A car pulled up to an apartment building. A man got out, middle-aged, glasses, unremarkable appearance. He looked like a retired school teacher or a small business owner. It was Totò Riina. Police waited until he was inside his vehicle, then moved in. Multiple units converged simultaneously. They blocked the street, surrounded the car, and extracted Riina at gunpoint. He didn't resist. He simply asked, "What took you so long?" The arrest sent shockwaves through both Cosa Nostra and Italian society. Riina, the boss of bosses, the architect of hundreds of murders, the man who had ordered the Capaci and Via D'Amelio bombings, was finally in custody. Newspapers printed the first photographs of his adult face. Italians who had imagined some monstrous figure were confronted with the banality of evil. A short, pudgy man with glasses who could have been anyone's grandfather. Television coverage was euphoric. Crowds gathered in Palermo to celebrate. Politicians claimed credit. But investigators knew the fight wasn't over. Riina was in custody, but Giovanni Brusca, the man who had actually pressed the detonator button at Capaci, was still free. Giovanni Brusca remained at large for 4 more years. He continued operating as a mafia enforcer, ordering killings, managing rackets, living in safe houses across Sicily. But the net was tightening. By 1996, the combination of pentiti testimony, surveillance technology, and relentless pressure had degraded Cosa Nostra's operational security. Brusca was moving constantly, unable to maintain normal operations, cut off from many of his previous contacts. His network was collapsing around him. On May 20th, 1996, Carabinieri officers arrested Brusca at a farmhouse near Agrigento. Like Riina before him, he didn't resist. Unlike Riina, Brusca would eventually become a pentito himself, but not before his trial for the Capaci bombing. The trial began in 1996 in a reinforced courtroom in Caltanissetta, Sicily. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Di Matteo's testimony describing Brusca's role, forensic evidence linking him to the bomb components, surveillance records tracking his movements before and after the attack, and testimony from dozens of other pentiti who described the planning and execution. Brusca was convicted on all counts. The sentence, life in prison plus isolation under Article 41 bis, Italy's harshest prison regime, designed specifically for high-level mafiosi. He would spend 23 hours a day in a solitary cell with minimal contact with the outside world. No possibility of running mafia operations from inside prison. The trial also convicted dozens of other mafia members who had participated in the Capaci operation. The bomb builders, the surveillance teams, the logistics coordinators. Some received life sentences, others received decades in prison. Most controversially, the prosecution demonstrated that several government officials had received warnings about the Capaci attack before it happened, but had failed to act. Exactly how much advanced knowledge existed and why it wasn't used to prevent the bombing remains one of the most contested aspects of the case. Some investigations suggested that elements within Italy's intelligence services had received vague warnings but hadn't taken them seriously. Others pointed to bureaucratic incompetence rather than malicious intent. What isn't disputed is the human cost. The Capaci bombing killed 5 people. Beyond the immediate fatalities, several others sustained injuries, though the exact number of wounded varies in different accounts, with some sources reporting as few as 5 seriously injured. But the impact extended far beyond the immediate casualties. The institutional legacy is measurable. The emergency laws passed after Capaci transformed Italian law enforcement's ability to combat organized crime. The DIA became one of Europe's most effective anti-mafia agencies. Asset seizure laws allowed authorities to confiscate billions of euros worth of mafia-controlled property, businesses, and bank accounts. Witness protection programs were strengthened, enabling more pentiti to cooperate safely. The legal framework Falcone pioneered, following financial trails, dismantling organizational hierarchies, using pentiti testimony strategically, became the global standard for prosecuting organized crime. Countries from Colombia to Russia studied Italy's anti-mafia methods and adapted them for local contexts. By the early 2000s, Cosa Nostra's power had been dramatically reduced. The major families were decapitated through arrests. Their financial networks were disrupted. The younger generation increasingly saw mafia membership as a path to prison rather than power. While the organization still exists, its influence is a fraction of what it was during Riina's era. The cultural legacy is harder to quantify but equally important. The Capaci and Via d'Amelio bombings broke the silence that had protected Cosa Nostra for generations. Schools began teaching anti-mafia history. Businesses refused to pay protection money, even at risk of violence. Journalists investigated organized crime without the paralyzing fear that had previously kept them silent. Organizations like Libra, founded specifically to combat mafia influence, mobilized thousands of young people across Italy. Properties seized from the mafia were converted into schools, community centers, and cooperatives. The cultural shift was profound. The mafia went from being romanticized as honorable outlaws to being recognized as parasitic criminals. Today, Highway A29 passes through Capaci with no interruption. The crater was filled in weeks after the bombing. The road was repaired, traffic flows normally, but at the exact spot where the bomb detonated, there's a memorial. It's simple. A white stone marker set into the roadside engraved with 5 names: Giovanni Falcone, Francesca Morvillo, Vito Schifani, Rocco Di Cilo, Antonio Montinaro. There are photographs and flowers, usually fresh, left by visitors who stopped to remember. On May 23rd each year, the anniversary of the bombing, thousands of people gather at the site for a commemoration ceremony. Students come by busload. Police officers stand at attention. Politicians give speeches, though the crowd is often skeptical of political rhetoric. The ceremony includes a moment of silence at exactly 5:56 p.m., the moment the bomb detonated. In that silence, you can hear the wind off the Mediterranean and the sound of traffic on the highway. Life continuing. Italy continuing. Giovanni Brusca, the man who pressed the button, spent 25 years in prison under the harshest conditions Italy's legal system allows. In 2021, he was released after cooperating extensively with prosecutors, providing testimony that led to dozens of additional convictions. The decision sparked massive controversy. Victims' families and anti-mafia activists argued that someone who had killed so many people, Brusca is believed responsible for over 100 murders, should never walk free, regardless of cooperation. Totò Riina died in prison in 2017 at age 87, having spent 24 years incarcerated. He never cooperated with authorities, never showed remorse, never acknowledged the damage he had caused. He died unrepentant, maintaining omertà to the end. Santino Di Matteo, who provided crucial testimony about the Capaci bombing, paid a horrific price for cooperation. In retaliation, the mafia kidnapped his 11-year-old son, Giuseppe, in 1993. The boy was held captive for 26 months, during which time Di Matteo was told that if he continued cooperating, his son would be killed. Di Matteo recanted his testimony, hoping to save Giuseppe's life. It didn't matter. In January 1996, the mafia strangled Giuseppe and dissolved his body in acid. When Di Matteo learned his son was dead, he resumed cooperation with prosecutors, providing even more detailed testimony than before. The question that haunts Italian history is whether the Capaci bombing could have been prevented. Investigations after the fact revealed that various intelligence agencies had fragments of information suggesting an attack was being planned. Phone intercepts had captured vague references to a big operation. Informants had reported increased activity among mafia bomb-making specialists. But the intelligence was never synthesized into actionable warnings. Different agencies didn't share information effectively. Some warnings were dismissed as unreliable. There's also evidence that Falcone himself was aware he was in danger, but believed his security measures were sufficient. He had survived previous assassination attempts. His armored cars, his security escorts, his unpredictable scheduling, all of it was designed to make him a difficult target. What he couldn't have anticipated was the scale of the Capaci operation. 500 kilograms of explosives, weeks of preparation, a level of planning and resources that exceeded anything Cosa Nostra had attempted before. Some investigators believe that elements within Italy's government or intelligence services may have had more specific advanced knowledge than they admitted publicly. Conspiracy theories range from simple incompetence to suggestions of active complicity, that some officials wanted Falcone dead because his investigations threatened powerful interests beyond just the mafia. What's certain is that the Capaci bombing represented a strategic miscalculation by Cosa Nostra. Riina believed that killing Falcone would demoralize the anti-mafia movement, demonstrate the mafia's invincibility, and force the Italian state into negotiations or retreat. Instead, it triggered exactly the opposite reaction: total mobilization against organized crime. In retrospect, Capaci marked the beginning of the end for the traditional Sicilian mafia. The organization survived, it still exists today, but its golden age ended on that highway in May 1992. The violence intended to preserve Cosa Nostra's power instead accelerated its destruction. Giovanni Falcone is buried in Palermo's cemetery, in a tomb that has become a pilgrimage site. The marble is often covered with notes, letters, and small objects left by visitors. Students, tourists, police officers, ordinary Italians who want to express gratitude to a man they never met. One note, left by a school child and preserved behind glass, reads, "Thank you for showing us that one person can make a difference." That sentiment captures Falcone's legacy better than any official monument. He was one person, a prosecutor with no political connections, no family dynasty, no inherited wealth. He had tools, the law, and he had courage, an apparently inexhaustible supply. And he used both to dismantle a criminal empire that had dominated Sicily for generations. His methods, following money, building organizational charts, turning insiders into witnesses, thinking systematically rather than emotionally, seem obvious now. But in the 1980s, they were revolutionary. Italian prosecutors had been fighting the mafia for decades with minimal success because they treated it as a collection of individual criminals rather than an organization. Falcone understood that you couldn't defeat Cosa Nostra by arresting one boss at a time. You had to understand the structure, map the relationships, cut the financial arteries, and dismantle the organization systematically. He paid for that understanding with his life. But the knowledge survived him. Today, the Falcone Foundation, established by his sister Maria, trains prosecutors and police officers from around the world in anti-organized crime techniques. His investigative methods are taught at universities. His example inspires new generations of magistrates who choose to specialize in mafia cases despite the risks. The Palermo airport, where Falcone landed on his final flight, is now officially named Aeroporto Falcone Borsellino. Ships, schools, streets, and public buildings across Italy bear his name. These honors are meaningful, but they're also insufficient. You can't rename enough buildings to compensate for a life cut short at 53. The most important legacy may be the most intangible, the cultural shift that followed the Capaci bombing. For decades, Sicilian society had operated under the assumption that the mafia was permanent, unchangeable, woven into the fabric of life itself. Fighting it was futile or suicidal. Cooperation with authorities was betrayal. That consensus shattered on May 23, 1992. The shock of seeing the state's most capable defender murdered in such a spectacular fashion forced Italians to confront uncomfortable questions. How had the mafia become so powerful? Why had society tolerated it for so long? What would happen if no one continued Falcone's fight? The answer to that last question came from an unexpected source. Ordinary people, teachers who integrated anti-mafia education into their classes, business owners who refused to pay protection money even when threatened, journalists who investigated corruption despite intimidation, students who organized demonstrations and awareness campaigns. The movement didn't erase the mafia. Criminal organizations are resilient and adaptive. But it eroded the mafia's social foundation. Younger generations grew up seeing Cosa Nostra not as honorable rebels, but as parasitic thugs. The cultural glamorization of mafia life, perpetuated by movies, music, and folklore, gave way to a more realistic assessment of what the organization actually represented. Murder, extortion, and the suppression of economic development. That cultural shift is Giovanni Falcone's most enduring victory. He didn't just imprison mafiosi, he changed how Italians thought about the mafia. The work is incomplete. The fight continues. But the trajectory is clear. In the end, the Capaci bombing failed to achieve its objective. It was meant to kill hope. Instead, it catalyzed change. The men who planned it, Riina, Brusca, and dozens of others, spent their remaining years in prison. Their power evaporated, their organization crippled. The judges they murdered, Falcone, Borsellino, and the countless others who fought Cosa Nostra before them, became symbols of something more powerful than fear. The possibility that courage, intelligence, and persistence can overcome institutionalized evil. On quiet evenings, when traffic on the A29 highway near Capaci thins out, you can stand at the memorial and imagine what happened here. The explosion that tore a hole in the earth, the screaming metal and burning rubber, the ambulances and helicopters, the grief that followed. But you can also imagine what came after. The crowds in Palermo chanting "Basta." The emergency laws passed in days rather than years. The arrest that dismantled Cosa Nostra's hierarchy. The young prosecutors who chose to continue Falcone's work despite the risks. The students who left flowers at this memorial year after year, refusing to forget. The road to Capaci still echoes with violence, but it also echoes with something else. The sound of a nation that finally decided to fight back. Giovanni Falcone once said, "He who doesn't fear death dies only once." On May 23, 1992, he proved he meant it. The Mafia killed him, but they couldn't kill what he represented. That turned out to be the difference between temporary violence and lasting change. The white markers stand silent beside the highway. 5 names carved into stone, a reminder that some defeats are really victories, and some deaths become the foundation for justice that outlasts any single life. The fight continues. But because of one prosecutor who refused to be intimidated, it continues with hope instead of resignation, with courage instead of silence, with the knowledge that the Mafia, for all its brutality and cunning, can be beaten by people willing to stand against it. That's the lesson written in the crater at Capaci. That's the legacy Giovanni Falcone left behind. And that's why, more than 3 decades after his murder, his name still matters, and his example still inspires those who continue the work he started.